And this session, we have a master storyteller with us, Ameen Haque. He's someone I'm personally inspired from, and in fact, I saw him telling stories to kids long time back, and that's where I kind of got enamored with his craft. And it's really a pleasure hosting him at Story Talkies. A real storyteller, a master storyteller, someone many of us look up to, is here to talk to us today. And well, he's someone who does theater, who has advertising background. He does workshops. He's been leading the storytelling as a discipline for organizations. So it's a pleasure hosting you, Amin. And what better way to know about the storyteller from the storyteller himself? So, if you can tell us about yourself.
I grew up in a very small town, a place called Vidyanagar, which most of us would not be able to locate on a map. Vidyanagar is close to Anand, the milk city, which is in between Ahmedabad and Baroda in Gujarat. My mother was a college professor. I was raised by a single parent. And around grade 7th, I stumbled upon theater and elocution, debate competitions, poetry recitation. The childhood was full of stories. We had a library right across our, our house with ample access to Champak, Chandamama, Amar Chitra Katha, Indrajal comics. And I had the classic journey that most of us growing up in India would have had, moving up from Indrajal comics and Amar Chitra Katha to famous Five and Secret Seven, to Hardy Boys, then and Nancy Drews, and then to uh, other kind of stories. And I ended up doing a lot more theater in college than most kids do. But I also come from middle class India, and while I wanted a career in theater, I knew that as middle class children, we have to maximize our earning potential, and theater certainly doesn't offer that. So I made a safer choice. I studied communication. I studied business administration, and I was lucky I got picked by one of the finest ad agencies in India, Ogilvy. I moved to Mumbai, and I started working in Ogilvy, Mumbai. But one of the first things I did when I moved to Mumbai was I joined a theater group in the evenings. So advertising by day, theater in the evenings, both of them forms of narrative. Later on, I dabbled with photography. I have a keen interest in cinema. I write poetry, but I see all of them as forms of narrative. And working with stories, even during my stint in marketing and later in consulting, I realized that stories are very powerful, but we don't leverage the power of stories as much as we can in our everyday lives. And I wanted to engage with storytelling in its deepest, widest, deepest possible manner. So, with a desire to tell stories to children, to teach storytelling to school teachers, and just spread the magic of stories everywhere, Storywallahs was born. And I remember early days, I used to, every weekend, I used to go and perform at Atta Galata, which is a bookstore and a library and a cafe and a performance area, all combined into one. And I would just stand up in the evenings and start telling stories, and children, parents, grandparents would all come together. I look forward to going back to doing that as soon as these times are behind us.
How do organizations leverage stories? So to say, the business storytelling bit, if you can give your perspective on what to you is business storytelling.
You know, it's a myth that children are the largest consumers of stories. They are not. As adults, we consume stories in the form of news, in the form of sports, in the form of judgments, in the form of political narrative, and in the form of business communication and advertising and PR and emails. We are the largest consumers of stories. But are those stories effective? Are those stories authentic? We consume hundreds of stories every day, but how many touch our heart and leave a mark? So I realized that while the human brain is a storytelling brain, and while we are all We are the only species that has the ability to tell and consume stories. Just because we are born with that ability doesn't make us good with it. Most of us are lucky to be born with two legs. That doesn't make us marathon runners. What marathon runners do is they exercise those muscles a lot more. Similarly, we may be born as human beings with the ability for narrative, but that doesn't necessarily make us good storytellers. It makes us storytellers, but doesn't necessarily make us good storytellers. And good storytelling requires that we engage, we exercise that muscle a lot more. And we engage with techniques and frameworks, and we reflect on our stories, and we work upon it. And then our stories can cut through the clutter and make a mark. A lot of our work today is with organizations like Google, Accenture, KPMG, Deloitte, JP Morgan, Reliance, Flipkart, Myntra, and a host of organizations like these, where we work with senior leaders and exercise their storytelling muscle. We literally take them into something like a story gym, where we push those muscles and give them frameworks and techniques so that they can tell a better story of the work they do, so that they can connect with people, so that they can inspire people, so that they can engage with them, and they can influence action without having to necessarily use PowerPoint. To be able to make powerful points without PowerPoint. That's what stories do. And we work with startup founders, entrepreneurs. They have to raise funds. It's one of the most difficult things in the world to do, to tell a story and get someone to write a check. So you see the ROI on storytelling right away. Every leader, whether you are in the startup space, large organization, or social impact, you need to be able to tell a good story. And that's where we come in.
As you said, you do help right from the big companies to the startups flex and exercise their story muscle. Would you have some tips for us, for our viewers, something that we can practice at home?
Absolutely. Here are three unusual tips. Unusual because we think storytelling is all about oratory, all about public speaking, all about making a big impact. Here are three unusual tips. The best storytellers in the world are not necessarily just great orators or public speakers or great at presentation skills. First, they lead with actions, because actions speak louder than words. Let me explain this through a story. It's a conversation on storytelling, and it's important that I illustrate this point with a story. Mr. Ratan Tata, back in his younger days, was traveling by car, and some of his colleagues were with him. And on the way, on the highway, the car broke down. Now, what do we do when a car breaks down? Most of us take a welcome stretch break. Those who smoke step out to smoke a cigarette. And that's exactly what started happening. But soon these colleagues realized that Mr. Tata was nowhere to be seen. So they went looking for him. Guess where they found him? He was sitting on the floor, on the road, sleeves rolled up, helping the driver fix the car. Now we can write in golden letters at the reception, on the poster, on the walls of our meeting rooms, conference rooms, that we treat everybody as equal, that there's dignity in labor. Story is not what we say. Story is what you do. So if you're a leader who's listening in, think about what is the message that you really want to convey, and how are you going to convey that, not through your words, but through your actions. Tip number two, the best story about any organization is not the one that that organization can tell. The best story about the organization is the story that its stakeholders, its customers can tell. So turn everybody you meet into a storyteller on your behalf. If you're a large organization and you're trying to hire and retain talent, the best story is not the one in your recruitment campaign. The best story is not the one in your employer branding campaign. It's the story your existing employees and your previous employees are telling on glassdoor.com. So first fix the story, because if your story is not in alignment, if the story that your customers are saying, your stakeholders are telling, if that's not in alignment with your campaign, you know what people are going to believe? Not your campaign, but what people say. Because word of mouth is far more powerful than any other form of communication. So fix your story before you start investing in your story, and convert every stakeholder you meet into a brand ambassador. It's it's not easy to sell, but what's more difficult than selling is to collect payment, and what's more difficult than both of these is to get a testimonial out of your client. So convert your clients into your brand ambassadors. And the third tip, and I call it unusual because again, we equate storytelling with oratory, public speaking, great messaging, great copywriting, great visuals, etc. But the best storytellers in the world are also great listeners. They listen, they observe. When I say listen, I don't just mean with the ears, but they listen, they observe, and they ask a lot of questions. So listen, listen to your stakeholders, listen to your employees, listen to your customers, listen to your donors, listen to your investors, and listen to not just what they are saying, listen to what they are not saying, and then read between the lines. Then you will know which story to tell.
One more thing that we generally see, as I mentioned, that storytelling is not oratory, it's not a copyright and good copy, it's not just a good email campaign. We are suddenly seeing in the past few years a whole generation which has come up as business storytellers, and more power to this creed. But we also need to understand how this skill is developed, right? We also need to know what it is not, and so therefore we can focus our energies on what it is and where we build our skills. In terms of the structuring of a story, how do we weave a story? The context, the structure, the empathy. If that part of what actually makes a story.
If you want to be a good storyteller, start telling stories to children. They are one of the most difficult audiences in the world to tell stories to. And children are like CEOs. They have low attention spans. CEOs have low attention spans. Children give you honest feedback. They don't know how to lie. And CEOs value their time as well. They're brutally honest with their feedback. So you want to be a good storyteller, practice holding on to the most precious commodity in the world, attention. It's a muscle. And see if you can stretch, just like we do exercises in the gym. If you can stretch that attention muscle, you grab that attention for 5 minutes. Next time, aim for 7. Next time, aim for 10. Next time, aim for 12. How can I keep somebody hooked for longer and longer and longer? First, think about what are good ways to begin a story, even before we get into a structure, because well begun is half done. If a headline of a newspaper article doesn't appeal to you, you don't read the rest of the article. If the title of a blog doesn't grab you and draw you in, you are nowhere going to read that blog. If a speaker stands up to speak at a conference, 5 speakers have spoken before you. If you don't begin well, I'll go out and start having coffee and networking with other people. You could be dropping a bomb in the 7th minute, but I'm not there in the room. I've already stepped out. So think about what are good ways to begin a story. 2, don't just think about the story from an I perspective. Now, this is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. in business storytelling. I'll give you a very simple example of this. A leader who stands up and says, "It is my dream that by 2030 our company will be a 50 billion company." Well, it's your dream. Go ahead, achieve it. Who's stopping you? You can't make it come true unless 5,000 people in your company embrace it as their dream as well. So drop the I. It's not your dream. Make it a collective dream. So move the story from an I story to a we story. It's not my company. It's not my need. It's not my, look at the story from the stakeholders' perspective. Go from I to we, build common ground. The third thing is look at conflict in the story and bring out the contrast in the story. Every story must have contrast. Ram versus Ravan, Kaurav versus Pandav, rich versus poor, good versus evil. These are, contrast is one of the classic elements in story. So, what is the contrast you can bring into the story? Now, when I say contrast, it may sound like an abstract idea. So, let me simplify that. What is the contrast between your offering and somebody else's offering? Employer branding, if that's what you're talking about, what is the contrast between working in this organization versus other organizations? If you're uh, if you're selling a product, offer me a contrast in that story between how things work today versus how they could if we were to embrace this product or service. A contrast between today and tomorrow. Lastly, and this is common knowledge, work with conflict and identify conflict that's relevant to the stakeholder and tell a story about how you're solving that.
Where do you find inspiration? Where do you find stories that you can tell to your audiences? What inspires you? What is the source of your stories?
Small stories. That's a big secret I'm sharing with you. Small stories. So I find stories in the small incidents in our everyday life rather than look for the big story. Now, big story is the Sachin Tendulkar like story. Simple big story. Sachin Tendulkar versus Vinod Kambli. Both of them made their debut together. Vinod Kambli was the better cricketer. And Sachin Tendulkar becomes a legend. How is that possible? Because he brought more comment. Now, that's the big story. Now, big story is also very important. Very, very important. But where do I find stories? In organizations, in the small, everyday actions. One of the biggest reservations that people have about storytelling is, oh my God, I can't be a storyteller because I don't know which big story to tell. In my life, there are no big events happening, but there are a lot of small events happening in your life, in your organization. Veer Sanghvi, former editor of Hindustan Times, is a food critic and a popular journalist. Now, as a food critic, what is that one food that you will hate the most? The most stale and sterile food in the world is airline food. So Veer Sanghvi, whenever he would travel by plane, he would carry food with him. If he was going from home, he would carry home food. If he was leaving from a hotel, he would ask the hotel to pack good food from the hotel. But he would never have airline food. It's stale, it's sterile, no matter which airline. Because airlines can't afford stomach upsets or allergies at 35,000 feet. They can't handle medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. That food has to be the safest and therefore the most the most boring food in the world. Sorry, apologies to airlines. Yeah, but there's a very interesting story I'd like to tell that he boarded a plane and he was sitting in business class, and when the air hostess brought out the trolley and started serving food to everyone, he took out his dabba. He'd asked the hotel or home to pack biryani for him, so he took out his dabba. Now the food inside had gone cold. The Ideally, the air hostess should have been offended that, who's this guy? He's not eating our food. He's bringing out his dabba. But the air hostess sees what he's doing and she says, "Sir, that food must have gone cold. Can I, can I heat it up for you?" Can you please give that to me? Let me heat it up for you. So he gives the biryani to her. What comes back is not biryani. What comes back is the biryani he gave on a plate, along with pickle, along with papad, along with raita, along with gulab jamun, and along with buttermilk. And he says, she didn't have to do that for me. Now, where does that attention to detail and that warmth and empathy that the word that you used, empathy, where does that come from? And how did she think that she had to do that for me? But she said, and then she says, what is biryani without pickle and raita? And if you like papad, I have some more. I hope you enjoy this meal. He wrote a blog in 2019 about the 10 best meals that he had. Surprisingly, one of them was this. Now, to me, that's a small story. Stories like this happen every day in organizations. Stories like this happen at a hotel every day. Stories like this happen in an airline every day. Stories like this happen in a manufacturing unit every day. Who's listening to those stories, the small stories, and capturing them? The role of a storyteller or a storytelling leader is not just to focus on vision, marketing, product, value prop, but also to capture the smaller stories because they are the biggest evidence of the big story in play.
Wonderful story, Amin. And with this, you so aptly told us about the essence and the importance of smallest of things around us. Uh, with small stories and big stories, it was such a lovely conversation with you. I mean, it was lovely speaking to you. And as I said, you keep inspiring all storytellers like us. We wish you all the very best. We'll keep having these conversations very often. And to our viewers, keep logged in. We'll come back with more stories in our next episode. Thanks a lot, Amin. Thanks for giving us your time.